laws were enforced and punishable by death, they opted for suicide and shot themselves. They were discovered 2 days later, though, still alive. In 1905, the Forest Protection Act was passed by Congress, and soon after that, the first National Fire Prevention Day was proclaimed. The 1910 fires in Montana and Idaho burned 3 million acres in 2 days, destroying entire communities and taking 85 lives. 72 of the lives lost were firefighters battling the blazes. People began to wake up to the need for fire laws and fire prevention and protection. Forestry in America in the early days was concerned about fire prevention, and the forester's chief goal was to protect the timber harvest. Prevention tools consisted primarily of signs to advise the forest users of their responsibility. In 1919, the Army Air Corps volunteered its services, and patrols with an Army pilot and observer began. The idea was tested on 2 national forests and was so popular that other areas began to use it. In the early years, fire prevention programs were directed toward educating the public about the dangers of indiscriminate burning and escaped campfires. As late as the 1930s, there was a disregard for the people who were trying to protect natural resources. The 30s and 40s proved that there were indications that our wildlands were becoming a shrinking treasure. Fire prevention became a national issue, all due to the need to protect the timber resource. The railroads and timber companies became allies in this protection effort. In 1932, the first report dealing with spark arresters on motorized equipment was released. This report and the increasing number of fires from motorized equipment led the San Dimas experiment station to establish the first spark arrestor standards. The first report on locomotive spark arresters was released in 1934, but federal regulations would not go into effect until 1978, 44 years later. State laws were beginning to be established, but few were enforced. San Dimas is still the cornerstone for spark arrestor research. As we entered the Depression era, other changes were taking place. Forestry employees were coming from the CCCs and were now responsible for a host of duties in resource management. It was not uncommon to find these folks working the front desks and serving as fire lookouts, as well as handling signing and other fire prevention tasks. These employees were jacks of all trades and were used with pride for many years. It was about this time that a study was undertaken to test the value of education concerning the still out-of-control woods burning habits. The problem was serious because stockmen, outraged at burning restrictions, set so many fires in one county that they exhausted the suppression forces and nearly caused bankruptcy. Determined to rally pro-sentiment nationwide, the fire agencies began to listen to suggestions from employees, and emotional pictures for fire prevention began. In 1939, President Roosevelt and members of his staff reviewed a poster showing a forest ranger who looked a lot like Uncle Sam, pointing to a raging forest fire, saying, "Your forest, your fault." Probably one of the best posters of the time. On the eve of World War II, fire protection posters equating fire prevention with national defense began. So it was the war that finally nationalized fire prevention programs. Fire prevention focused high priority on the importance of timber products. After all, many things needed for the war effort came from our natural resources. Incendiary fire became equal to sabotage, and woods arson fires were investigated by the FBI. An employee of a national forest conceived the idea of seeking assistance from a national advertising agency for a wartime fire prevention campaign. In the spring of 1942, a nerve-tingling event occurred very close to home. A Japanese submarine surfaced near the coast of Southern California and fired a salvo of shells that exploded an oil facility near Santa Barbara. It was felt further attacks could bring a disastrous loss of life and destruction of property. There was also a fear that exploding shells and incendiary balloons launched by the Japanese in the timber stands of the Pacific coast could set off raging forest fires. With the country at war, most of the experienced firefighters and able-bodied men had gone to the armed forces. The home communities had to deal with forest fires as best they could. If people could be urged to be more careful, perhaps some fires could be prevented. Careless matches aid the Axis, and our carelessness, their secret weapon, were catchy phrases suggesting that people themselves could prevent fires and help win the war. So the newly formed Wartime Advertising Council took on the task, and now professional advertising talent was mobilized behind fire prevention. Because of that effort, the CFFP program, Cooperative Forest Fire Prevention, was established and is still in place today. But field fire prevention work almost came to a standstill as men were sent off to war. People in the wildlands had very little contact from agency personnel. This made it even more important to utilize this national advertising effort. Person-caused fires during this time were due to smoking, railroads, and careless burning. If an agency had someone in the field, they were lucky. Usually, a unit had one field person, and they would be in the field for months at a time. They patrolled heavily used roads, made contacts in campgrounds, and relied on signing. These employees were the rangers. They did everything: fire prevention, trail maintenance, signing, and they fought fires. The end of World War II saw the need for the Advertising Council to promote a happier theme for fire prevention, and so obtained the rights from Walt Disney to use Bambi to promote fire prevention. Using animals was a great success, so the idea of the bear was born. Smokey, named after a fireman in New York, wore blue jeans and a hat to typify the outdoor type. The first Smokey Bear poster appeared in 1944. In 1947, the slogan, "Remember, only you can prevent forest fires," was introduced. In 1947, Smokey came to radio through the voice of Jackson Weaver, a noted radio personality in Washington, D.C. In 1948, Rudy Wendelin, after a tour of duty in the Navy, returned to the Forest Service and produced the Smokey Bear as we know him today. With the end of the war, men were returning to their jobs, and with more people available, more action could zero in on the major fire prevention problems, such as locomotive and equipment fires, escaped campfires, and other causes. Railroad inspections were done in those days, but there were no federal laws and few state laws. However, during extreme fire danger, a patrol might follow a train to extinguish any fire that may occur. Burning permits were required in those days, but very few people bothered to get them. We were a nation brought up on burning to clear fields, just as Native Americans had used fire to increase forage and wildlife habitat. The 1950s saw increased building in and around the wildlands. Increased use by a growing population began to become a major consideration for wildfire prevention specialists. Some areas were actually able to employ fire prevention specialists to make public contacts. This type of activity seemed to work well. In 1950, an important event took place in fire prevention history. A small bear cub was rescued from a forest fire on the Lincoln National Forest. Early in July, the cub was flown to Washington to become the living symbol of forest fire prevention. By 1952, the Smokey Bear symbol was well established, and the Smokey Bear Act was approved by Congress and signed by President Eisenhower. In those days, there were no Smokey Bear costumes. The first costume was made by Rudy Wendelin and his wife Carol in their kitchen. Smokey participated in numerous major events in those days, such as Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, the Rose Parade, and he even had his own weekly television series. There were very few school programs, and it was still normal for railroad companies, power line companies, and industrial agencies to self-enforce regulations. These agencies looked to the fire service as experts and were generally cooperative. In the 1950s, there was no formalized fire prevention training, and everything was learned on the job. It was at this time that children playing with matches surfaced as a priority cause and resulted in the implementation of the National Junior Forest Ranger Program. Smokey also devoted a children's theme poster to this problem on an annual basis. The 1960s showed a more organized approach to wildfire prevention. Conferences, training, inspection procedures, codes, and ordinances began to evolve to support field fire prevention operations nationwide. In the mid-1960s, the Western Media Office of the Forest Service developed a major public relations program that assisted fire prevention efforts for several years. The deal was made to incorporate a forest ranger into the Lassie TV program. So Corey Stewart began his career with the